Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the UCAN session for the portion of Environment and Ecology, where today in the next couple of hours we shall be discussing the various different areas associated with environment and ecology which have remained in news and which are relevant for your examination, be it for the prelims or the mains. Along with that, we shall also be taking a look at the practice sample questions, both multiple choice type of questions as well as a subjective question also, in order to understand how to expect or what to expect at the time of the exam. Wherever any of you feel any kind of an issue, any kind of a doubt, inability to understand, please feel free to ask the doubts. We shall be taking the doubts after the finishing of the topics or mostly at the end of the session. If you like this video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. So without further ado, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to have a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to cover around 8 different topics. So World Meteorological Organization has come up with the greenhouse gas bulletin for 2023, which is a kind of a detailed account for greenhouse gas emissions. So with the help of this, we shall be understanding the key findings and the key trend thereby. Then Conference of Parties number 16 to the Convention on Biological Diversity has been held in Cali, Colombia. So we are going to talk about the key extracts of that Conference of Party. A very brief background of the Convention on Biological Diversity is also something that we are going to discuss. Then Nature Conservation Index, the first Nature Conservation Index has been released, where India has found itself in the lowermost rankings out there across the world. So what is the reason for that? And what are the parameters used to measure the Global Nature Conservation Index? That is something that we are going to analyze. Then Emissions Gap Report 2024 has been released prior to the UNFCCC meeting at Baku in Azerbaijan. That is going to be the Conference of Parties number 29, which is going to be held this month itself. So what does that emission gap report indicate? The per capita emissions, historical emissions, and what are the actions required? That is something we are going to cover. Then tiger relocation and translocation to the region of Simlipal Tiger Reserve. Now this will cover your area in news and also species in news. As has been the trend with every UCAN session, we discuss certain articles relevant for your prelims and mains, certain species which have been in news and certain protected areas also which have remained in news. Then Kodo millet is another one of those plant species which has been in news, owing to the fact that the Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve has recently reported the death of 10 elephants. And this is the first time in recent memory where 10 elephants have died of the same herd in such close quarters. So what is that Kodo millet which is suspected to have caused those elephant deaths? That is something we are going to study. But Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve, I hope that you would have covered it in our already done video about places in news. So in the places in news, we have also covered about Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve. So do take a look at that if you have not already looked at the video. Then Nilgiri tit butterfly is a new kind or a butterfly species to be found in southern India. That has also been in news. Then Great Indian bustard, the species has been in news owing to the fact that artificial insemination has worked in that case, which gives a lot of hope for the conservation measures for the Great Indian bustard. Right? So these are the various different topics that we are going to cover in detail, starting with the first topic, that is WMO's Greenhouse Gas Bulletin 2023. Now, what is that? So first of all, when we talk about it, so World Meteorological Organization has released the Global Greenhouse Gas Bulletin for 2023. Now, World Meteorological Organization, what is that? It is a specialized agency of UN. That is something you have to keep in mind. It is a specialized agency of UN which came into inception in around 1950. And prior to that, you had the IMO, International Meteorological Organization. Now, the work of WMO is to carry out the scientific study and track the meteorological activities all across the globe when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions or the other concentration of global gases, toxic gases, ozone depleting substances, tracking the change in temperature. All of those detailed aspects are covered by World Meteorological Organization. Now, this is one of the WMO's flagship publication. Now, it is generally published prior to the Conference of Parties meeting of UNFCCC, just so that the stakeholders and the members of Framework Convention on Climate Change, they get an idea about how to proceed and also get an idea of stock taking regarding what is the condition of emissions across the world, so that the policy actions can be dovetailed and streamlined accordingly. Now, what is the finding? That is interesting and important. So greenhouse gas levels have surged to a new high in 2023, committing the planet to rising temperature for many years to come, and also creating many of the irreversible changes across the planet. Now, for those of us who are not very well initiated about it, a very brief about the greenhouse effect and what do we understand by the greenhouse gases. So basically, across the entirety of the planet, you have a blanket of gases. That is what we refer to as the atmosphere. Now, atmosphere does consist of a variety of different gases, from nitrogen to oxygen to carbon dioxide, argon, and also a variety of other gases in smaller proportion like water vapor. Then you have ground level ozone, nitrous oxide. All those gases are present. So what actually happens is that when you have the high energy solar radiation or the solar rays which come upon the surface of the planet Earth, they heat the surface of planet Earth. Now, upon getting heated, ideally, the planet Earth also starts to release the heat. That is in the form of long waves, low energy, long waves. That is also what is referred to as the long wave terrestrial radiation. Long wave terrestrial radiation. Okay. Now this terrestrial radiation, terrestrial because it is released from the Earth's surface. Now, this heat is gained by the planet Earth from the sun, and the heat is then eventually lost by the surface of Earth as well, and that maintains the heat budget of the planet. Having said that, you have the presence of certain gases, and these gases, they end up trapping the heat, and that heat is then re-radiated back, increasing the amount of heating that planet Earth experiences. Right? So that impact or that effect is what we refer to as the greenhouse effect, whereby the heat is re-radiated back onto the surface, increasing the temperature. Now, if you think about it, greenhouse effect, is it good for the planet Earth or is it bad for planet Earth? What do you think? Let me know. So basically, when we talk about this greenhouse effect, it is basically good, both. Very nice. So, Shubham, Kiran, you are correct. Pradeep, Antara, you are correct. Deepika, correct. So you see, greenhouse effect is inherently good. That is something which has allowed for the presence of or the maintenance of temperature across the planet Earth. You see, otherwise across the other planets, what do you observe? That daytime temperatures are very high. But then, as the planet moves and it is not facing the sun anymore, any portion of the planet is not facing the sun anymore, that is when the temperatures during the night time in other planets, they dip to around minus 100, minus 80, minus 150 degrees Celsius, depending upon which planet are you talking about. So imagine if gases like carbon dioxide, etc. would not have been present across the planet Earth, then daytime temperatures would have been in the excess of 50, 60, maybe or even 40 degrees Celsius. Nighttime temperatures would have dipped to around minus 80, minus 90. planet would have been uninhabitable space. The reason that the planet is inhabitable is because of the greenhouse effect, the presence of gases like carbon dioxide, which maintain the temperature overall. So that is the good characteristic. But then what has been happening ever since the Industrial Revolution and ever since what we refer to as the industrial era? Since that point of time, the amount of carbon emissions have been increasing. And that increase in carbon emission is leading to more amount of heat getting trapped. And that is putting the heat balance of planet Earth out into disarray, due to which the planet continues to gain temperature and continues to get heated up beyond the acceptable limit. Now, what are the various different greenhouse gases? So that is the damaging impact. So the correct answer is that while it is beneficial for the existence of life, but then that increased concentration of greenhouse gases that increases the amount of heat and leads to a global temperature rise. By the way, mind you, just for those who are not aware of it, it is not for the first time that the planet is experiencing a sudden rise in CO2 concentration. If you take a look at the pages of history, that is around 90 million years ago or even to 50 million years ago, so or even as recently as 5 million years ago. Now, in all these cases, due to volcanic eruptions which had occurred and widespread volcanic eruptions which ruptured the planet across the planet Earth, all areas across the planet Earth experienced so much amount of volcanic activity that the concentration of CO2 across the planet increased tremendously. And as a consequence of that, the global temperatures rose. Not only did the global temperatures rise, but also along with that, the sea level rose significantly. In fact, as recent as 5 million years ago, the sea level was around 5 to 10 meters higher than what you see today. So imagine a condition where the sea level is 10 meters higher. Then all the coastal areas, the low-lying islands that you are thinking about, all of them would have been submerged. So the planet goes through these phases of warming. But coming back to it, there are certain gases which have a pertinent or an increased role to play in terms of the greenhouse effect. So here, which are the various different gases which cause that greenhouse effect? One of the foremost is CO2. By the way, when we talk about this greenhouse effect, it is also carried out by a vital role is played by water vapor, not liquid water, water vapor. So both of these, in fact, they do not come under the category of pollutant gases, but they come in the category of greenhouse gases, which means naturally if they are present in regular proportion, they are not damaging to the environment or the health. But then in increased proportion, they carry out the greenhouse effect. Other than that, you have methane, which is also significantly responsible. Then you have nitrous oxide. Then you have ground level ozone, right? All of these are basically some of the, you also have gases like sulfur hexafluoride, etc. All of these basically are the greenhouse gases. Now, this particular report which has been published, that report, the Greenhouse Gas Bulletin, tracks the presence, not the emission source, but the presence of the gases overall across the global environment. So that gives you an idea about also the reasons why this increase in the gases concentration would have occurred, right? So what are some of the key findings? The key findings have indicated that overall the CO2 concentration, and mind you, how do you measure the CO2 concentration? In parts per million. So the CO2 concentrations have indicated a sharper rise in the last couple of years. So that rise has been very, very sharp here. I hope it is visible. So across, there has been a regular kind of a rise, but then the CO2 concentration has suddenly increased. Now, when you take a look at the growth rate of CO2, then that growth rate had dipped during the COVID years, but after that it has again indicated an increase in concentration, right? So during the COVID years, obviously less fossil fuel was burnt, less transportation was being used, industrial activities were at a slowdown, and those were the years of La Nina, means excessive rainfall. So anyways, the CO2 concentration in air had reduced. Now, all the CO2 which is present in the air, now there is natural mechanism by which the CO2 is absorbed by land and water. So the bulletin also highlights that around half of the CO2, less than half of the CO2, which is emitted both by natural as well as anthropogenic sources, less than half of it remains in the atmosphere. Rest of it is absorbed. Where? Oceans absorb CO2 directly from the atmosphere, from the air-water interface, accounting for around 1/4 of the CO2 absorption. Then the ocean, 30% is what is absorbed by the land areas. How does land absorb CO2? With the help of the plants, right? The vegetation that you have. The vegetation, basically the plants would require the intake of CO2 to carry out photosynthesis, and that is where the CO2 is taken in as well. The CO2 which is absorbed by the oceans, that is what is referred to as blue carbon. A previous year question was asked associated with what do you understand by blue carbon and what do you understand by green carbon, right? And the ones which are absorbed by the land and the vegetation on the land, that is what is also referred to as the green carbon. There is also CO2, by the way, which is stored in the wetlands, right? It is stored in the wetlands, and that is also a kind of a carbon capture. What is the name which is given to that? The CO2 which is captured and stored by the wetlands and the marshes. Very good. Beautiful. That is what is referred to as teal carbon. So wetlands, when they absorb that and store that, that is your teal carbon. And the bulletin also indicates that when we talk about the fact that 30% of the CO2 is absorbed by land, it is not fixed year on year, that every year 30% will be absorbed. Certain years may be slightly more. During the conditions of El Nino, you have drier conditions, drier weather conditions, dry climate. So in the conditions of dry climate, the trees will shed their leaves. Their ability to carry out photosynthesis will substantially reduce. So that is why their ability to absorb CO2 will also reduce. So you can have a natural correlation here that whenever you have El Nino years, the rate of green carbon stored or the amount of green carbon stored naturally, that reduces. And you know what? When you have El Nino year, for example, last year was an El Nino. The first half of this year was an El Nino year. And we have talked about it, be it in a video of Places in News, be it otherwise also, that there have been wide-ranging forest fires, be it South America, be it Australia, be it in various parts of India, other regions of Europe, there have been wildfires. Why? Because El Nino brings in a dry climate, a dry weather condition. And with that dry weather condition, there is always a scope of forest fires and wildfires germinating and coming into existence, right? So that is how you have to correlate the topic. Remember, in our previous video and in episode 2 of Places in News, we had talked about the utility or basically the forest fire damaging the region in Argentina. So that is how you have to correlate the various topics for your exam. Now, the finding also indicates that methane as a gas, which accounts for 16% of the warming effect, now that methane concentration has also increased. right? Now, approximately 40% of the methane is emitted into the atmosphere by natural sources, and 60 natural sources means what? Wherever, let's suppose, there's decomposition which is carried out, methane is released, right? Whenever you carry out cultivation of crops in, let's suppose, in a kind of a typical flood irrigation, for example, paddy as a crop we grow. So that is something which will come in anthropogenic, but then you have natural wetlands, marshes, etc., where the water evaporates, that becomes a natural source. So that is where you have a lot of natural sources of methane emission. But simultaneously, you also have the presence of anthropogenic, irrigation, animal husbandry, animal slaughter, all of that, energy. Energy sector is one of the larger sources of methane emission, and be it the exploration of or the extraction of fossil fuel, be it the refining process of fossil fuel, or be it even selling of fossil fuel, at each of the stages there is significant emission of methane. So methane emissions are also increasing significantly, and mind you, per molecule methane has got a greater amount of warming potential as compared to carbon dioxide per molecule, if you consider. But then, methane is still not considered to be a great contributor to global warming as compared to CO2. Why? Because of two reasons. First reason is the concentration of methane in the atmosphere in itself is less. Observe here. You have the concentration which is indicated in parts per billion, whereas here we had parts per million. So carbon dioxide concentration is more, methane concentration is less. Secondly, methane does not stay in the atmosphere for a longer period. Methane reacts with the hydroxyl ions, disintegrates to form water vapor and carbon dioxide. Otherwise, again I will reiterate, per molecule, the impact of methane when it comes to heating is much greater as compared to CO2. Okay. Now, then even when we talk about N2O, nitrous oxide, there also. So here the concentration, overall global average concentration of CO2 has reached 420 parts per million, methane 1934 parts per billion, and nitrous oxide 336 parts per billion. Figures, please don't retain the figures, don't rectify the figures or data pointer, not required for your UPSC examination. Take a look at the trends. Trends are more important to catch. But what you have to understand is that overall, as compared to the pre-industrial level, the CO2 levels have increased by 151%, methane emissions have increased by 265%, and N2O emissions have increased by 125%. Now, methane emissions have increased. Why? Primarily the use of fossil fuels, extension of agriculture. These are the two reasons. When we talk about nitrous oxide, what is the source of emission for nitrous oxide? Let me see if we are aware about it or not. From what is the source from which nitrous oxide is released? So nitrous oxide, by the way, is released again by both natural as well as anthropogenic sources. Whenever you have forest fires, at that point of time, nitrous oxide is also released. Right, whenever you have volcanic eruption, that is again a natural source of emission of nitrous oxide. So that is a natural process by which you have these gases which are put into the atmosphere. But then what are the artificial or anthropogenic sources? Anthropogenic sources, burning of fossil fuels, right? Even mining activities and mineral extraction. All of these can lead to nitrous oxide emission. So sources of emission is again one of the favorite pet areas of UPSC. All these three, CO2, N2O, CH4, can be released naturally as well as anthropogenically. Then other findings. From 1990 to 2023, the warming effect of our climate by greenhouse gases increased by about 51%. So the amount of warming has almost increased by half. And CO2 alone is responsible for 81% of that overall heating. And the last time, and this is where it gets interesting, as I told you, the last time planet Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was around 3 to 5 million years back. And that is when the temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer as compared to today, and the sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher as compared to today. 20 meters higher sea level would submerge the entire eastern coastline of India, along with Sundarbans, the deltaic stretch, along with the western coastal plains, the Kutch-Kathiawar coastline, Konkan coastline, and also significant portion of Malabar coastline would get submerged. Lakshadweep would disappear. Many portions of Andaman would also end up getting submerged. So that is the level that we are approaching and that we are thinking about. Now, what are the reasons why you have had such an increase in CO2 or the greenhouse gas emission? Now, this is not mentioned in the bulletin per se, but this is something that we can extract and talk about it on our own. Why is it that overall the concentrations are increasing? First of all, anthropogenic action. And under anthropogenic action, you have industrial activities, increase in the scope of industrial activities as the global order is coming back to growth path again. The industrial activities have increased, and due to the increase in industrial activity, emissions have also increased. Then you have transportation. Then one of the other agents which consistently and in a large amount adds to the amount of CO2 is the presence of conflict. Whenever you have global conflicts in place, it has been found, various reports have indicated that during the presence or during the time of any global conflict, there has always been an increase in CO2 concentration. Why? You see, whenever there is a conflict, for example, Russia-Ukraine war, or the war which is going in the region of West Asia, in all these areas, trees are cut down, deforestation happens, there is a lot of firepower which is used. All of them basically end up increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Then climate feedback loop. So what is happening is that you have a level of warming, global warming, right? Now global warming, what it is doing? It is leading to the evaporation of water of wetlands and marshlands. Due to increased temperature from the wetlands, from the ponds, from the lakes, more water will evaporate. As more water will evaporate, what will happen? All the methane that was trapped, that will be released. And all that released methane will then further lead to more warming because of the greenhouse effect. That will further accelerate the rate of evaporation of the wetlands. So it is a kind of a complete feedback loop cycle, right? Then El Nino conditions. El Nino conditions means lesser rainfall. Lesser rainfall means drought-like conditions, which means what? Natural degradation of the vegetation. Where you had dense trees, lesser number of trees prevail, right? Also, due to the dry conditions, you have global occurrences of wildfires. We have taken a look at it in Argentina, in the region of Brazil, etc. But then also, due to El Nino conditions, as we have seen, the density of vegetation tends to reduce. And whenever that happens, the natural absorbing ability of CO2, that also takes a hit. And that is where you have the increase in concentration. And it is, by the way, again a feedback cycle. You see, when you have El Nino conditions or drought conditions, dry conditions will lead to basically what? The dieback of the forests, where dieback basically refers to the forest density, the quality of vegetation that declines. As a consequence of that, less ability to absorb CO2, ability to absorb CO2. When you have lesser ability to absorb CO2, means what? More CO2 in atmosphere. When that happens means more heating, more greenhouse effect, and more heating will lead to further dry conditions. And mind you, when the plants, they end up dying, that also disturbs the natural water cycle, and that in itself can lead to creation or the sustenance of dry conditions. So these are the factors due to which globally the emissions of greenhouse gas and the concentration of greenhouse gases have been increasing in the recent past. So in this entire topic, what have we studied? What are the greenhouse gases, the effect of it, what is this greenhouse gas bulletin, why it is issued, and why it is issued every year, so that the policymakers can take decision what is WMO, the role of WMO. And we have also taken a look at individual gases and the findings in terms of the increase in concentration, the fact about heating by methane, the sources of emission, and the reasons why the emissions have increased in the past year. Okay? Any doubts that we have? Is radiation emitted by communication also a contributor to global warming? Are you talking about the mobile communication and those communication devices, the radiation that is emitted? No, that is a very different. That is not a radiation which is emitted due to heat, right? So that is very weak radiation for that matter. Okay? Now, what is the way forward? Conservation of natural landscapes, protection of natural landscapes, be it the forests, be it the marshlands, the wetlands, they need to be preserved and conserved in large number. Reduction of emission, there is no two way around it. Be it the industrial emission, be it the vehicular emission, be it the dust particle emission, we have to reduce it. And that is where shifting to renewables and sticking to the climate goals across the globe has to be the priority number one. Detailed monitoring of sources of emission needs to be carried out, and there also needs to be financial support to the underdeveloped countries when it comes to maintenance of the natural landscape, when it comes to transitioning to cleaner fuel, renewables. You do need the underdeveloped and developing nations also to step up. But many of the times they don't have the resources which are required, and that is where global financial assistance is the need of the hour. Okay? Afforestation programs can be carried out, but prior to that, maintain the natural landscape. Don't allow land degradation in the existing forest area. For example, in Indonesia, in the region of Malaysia, there you have very dense tropical rainforest. Now, every year, thousands of hectares of land in that region are cleared for the cultivation of palm oil. Right? So those kind of events or activities tend to have a lot of damage. Mangroves, for example, they are being cleared across many of the countries, tropical countries particularly, for cultivation of rice. Now, not only rice cultivation becomes a source of methane emission, but that also reduces and significantly slashes down the amount of CO2 which is captured by the land. So those activities where the natural landscape is threatened, those need to be curbed. Okay? I hope the entire topic is very clear. Direct seeding of rice, zero tillage, so sustainable practices in agriculture, etc. That can be done. Now let us take a look at a practice question. Consider the following statements regarding Greenhouse Gas Bulletin 2023 released recently. It is a biennial report prepared by WMO to track the carbon emissions. Emissions of CO2 have indicated a consistent increase over the past 2 decades. Which of the above statement is or are incorrect? Take a look at the options and do let me know what the correct answer is. What do you think is the correct answer? I'll give you around 30 seconds. Okay. While many of you have given the answer B, and D, right? Few of you have given the correct answer. Niharika, Alan, Harish, Bhanu, good. Priyanka, Ilma, Ilma incorrect. Mohan, correct. So take a look at it. Is it a biennial report which is released? Biennial means every 2 years. Is it a biennial report? No. It is something which is released annually. So that is incorrect. That is why you have to concentrate on the terms. Emissions of CO2 have indicated a consistent increase over the past 2 decades. Is that correct? No. During the time of the COVID pandemic, the growth rate was significantly lowered. So if the growth rate was lowered, that is where immediately you can say it can never be a consistent rise. So that is also incorrect. And the catch of the question is you have to find out which of them are incorrect. So the answer will be C. That is both 1 and 2. Right? These kind of questions UPSC always throws at you. So that is why you have to be prepared to look at whether incorrect or correct option is asked in this. Now, if you don't have any doubts, we move on to the next topic. And that is Conference of Parties number 16 to the Convention on Biological Diversity was recently held in Cali in Colombia. So here, when you take a look at it, first of all, what is this Conference of Parties to CBD? Before that, CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. So what is this concept of a convention and a concept of a protocol? For those of us who are unaware about it, very briefly, convention is a kind of a grouping coming together where people end up deciding the long-term goals, right? They end up deciding the long-term goals, agenda, or future actions which are required to be taken. But then, when you talk about long-term goals, for example, let's suppose in the long run, you want to make India a developed country. So that will be a convention, right? When people decide that we'll make India a developed country, that will be a convention. But how do you make India a developed country? For that, you need achievable targets, target setting that by 2025, we need to achieve this. By 2030, we need to be doing this. By 2035, this is where we want to reach. So that targeted goal setting is the protocol to the convention. That is why across the globe, you will find that most of the conventions, they are followed by a protocol. Vienna Convention followed by Montreal Protocol. Climate Change Convention followed by Kyoto Protocol, right? Similar is the case with Convention on Biological Diversity followed by the Nagoya and the Cartagena Protocol. Okay? So that is basically where you see the case of protocols and the convention. Now, whenever you have a convention, now there people will interact, people will decide on, and the members will decide on what future course of action needs to be taken to achieve that goal. So the coming together of the members, that is what is the Conference of Parties. That is what we have as the Conference of Parties. Now this Convention on Biological Diversity, this was arrived at in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. Earth Summit at Rio. And hence it is also known as the Rio Summit. Okay. Now, here, this Convention on Biological Diversity, it basically had 3 agendas or 3 major goals. What were the 3 major goals? Bhanu, I'll take your question after this topic. So here, what were the 3 major objectives of the CBD? First was Conservation of biological diversity. Conservation of biological diversity. Second was sustainable use of biological diversity. Sustainable use of biodiversity and its products. And the third was fair and equitable access and benefit sharing. These were the three agendas and objectives. Now, in order to achieve these, the conference of parties would happen regularly. Now, unlike the case of Convention on Climate Change, where the conference of parties, that meeting happens every year. In the case of CBD, this COP happens every 2 to 3 years, right? The last time that it was held was in a kind of a joint session where the first half was held in Kunming in China, and the second half, owing to the COVID pandemic, it could not be conducted in China for a great detail. And then the second half of that meeting took place in the region of Montreal in Canada. And there you had a global biodiversity framework which was arrived at, fixing a certain level of targets which need to be achieved for the conservation of biological diversity. So presently you have the 16th meeting or the 16th COP to the convention which has taken place. Okay. Now, here, conservation of biological diversity is ensured by national biodiversity targets that the countries have, by the various initiatives that the countries take, etc. Now, sustainable use of biodiversity, for example, genetically modified products, for example, living modified organisms. You have many of the mutants. For example, if you consider a species known as liger, right? Now, there you have a crossbreeding of a lion and a tiger. So those kind of species, you cannot expect them and expect yourself to introduce them in the forest immediately and naturally and for them to be able to survive or the other species to be able to coexist. No, the impact on biodiversity will be very significant. So for that, to ensure that there is a sustainable use, there was devising of certain rules and regulations that any genetically modified species, what are also referred to as LMOs, living modified organisms, how should they be introduced into the ecosystem? And for that, in order to fulfill the second objective, you had a protocol which was arrived at. And what was the protocol? You had the Cartagena Protocol. Okay? That was arrived at. So, this Cartagena Protocol, now there can be a question associated that genetically modified plants or animals, they are dealt under which convention? So, they are dealt under Convention on Biological Diversity itself. That is something you have to keep in mind. Okay. So, Cartagena Protocol was arrived at for this. And to ensure that there is fair and equitable access and benefit sharing for the local population, to ensure that the local population also benefits out of the use of biodiversity found in that area, you had the devising of another protocol, and that was the Nagoya Protocol. Nagoya Protocol. So these are the two protocols associated with Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, once you become a member of this convention, which India is, you have to make your own national laws in order to adhere to the conditions, in order to fulfill the objectives. And in order to adhere to the conditions of the convention, India had passed the Biodiversity Act 2002. And that Biodiversity Act 2002, by the way, also had the same three objectives out there. The three objectives that you see, the same three objectives India's law also has. So that is basically Biodiversity Act 2002. To fulfill the agenda which is required. Under that, you have the National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Authority, then Biodiversity Management Committee at the district level. So that is basically where the permission is required if you want to use any kind of a genetic data, any genetic sequencing information, any biodiversity usage that you want to extract and transport it out of the country, you need the prior permission so that the local population is first of all benefited and given the benefit out of it. So that is where we had the Biodiversity Act solving the same purpose. Now, the goals of CBD is something that we have mentioned. Now you see, this CBD talks about the conservation of biodiversity in the long run. Now in 2010, when the Nagoya Protocol was arrived at that point of time, the convention in the Conference of Parties number 10 at that point of time had set for itself HE biodiversity targets. Biodiversity targets. Now these HE biodiversity targets were to be achieved by 2020. Okay. Now these included various different kind of measures like reducing the threat to biodiversity, reducing the level of pollution, reducing the impact by invasive alien species, getting or mainstreaming the conversation about the protection of biodiversity. All of these, National Biodiversity Strategic Plan, all of that was to be done. But you can apply your natural logic that whether the objectives were met or not. Obviously not. So then, what to do after 2020? For that, the countries met again, the parties met again. But then, at that point of time, in 2020, the world was suffering from COVID. So in 2021, the Conference of Parties number 15 was partially held in Kunming in China. And then in 2022, it was again partially, the second half of it was held in Montreal, Canada. So in COP 15, Conference of Parties number 15, you had the Kunming Montreal Agreement, right, which was arrived at by the world. And this was also where you had a global biodiversity framework to be achieved by 2050, having targets up till 2030, which was set up. This was basically to decide the future course of action after 2020, what course of action needs to be pursued or needs to be followed. So that is where you had the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Now, this was the previous COP and it had set certain targets. What were the targets? 30 by 30 agreement. This was to bring 30% of the area of the land and the oceans under conservation by the year 2030. So, presently, you have less than 20% of land, less than 15% of the or 20% of the water which is under conservation. So, to bring around 30% of the land area, 30% of the oceans under conservation some way or the other. Then to reduce the impact by invasive alien species by 50% by the year 2030. Reduce the impact of pollution, benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information of genetic data, and also galvanize financial resources to the tune of $200 billion annually by the year 2030 so as to ensure conservation and protection is carried out. So these were the various goals which were set in 2022 in Conference of Parties number 15. So the follow-up Conference of Parties was held this month or last week in Cali, Colombia. So there were a lot of expectations out of that. But what are the outcomes? Outcomes of the Conference of Parties number 16. First of all, there was devising of the Cali Fund. Now that Kali fund, now you can have a question associated with the individual funds also. All those of you who are appearing for the exam next year or year after that, UPSC can ask a direct question that Kali fund has been set up by whom, right? So you have to keep in mind that as per CBD. So the Kali fund to ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of digital sequence information. Okay, now at least 50% of the Kali fund will focus on the self-identified needs of the indigenous. What do we mean by self-identified needs of indigenous people? So basically, if you talk about the local population, they have their own requirements, right? For example, let's suppose they have some developmental requirements, they have a cultural requirement. So the fund will be given to the indigenous people to be used in what they want, rather than a prescriptive mechanism where someone from above, administrator from above, will tell them that no, we will do this with this amount of money. No, indigenous people will have their fate in their own hands. So people and local communities, particularly women and youth, their voices will be given more value. Setting up of a subsidiary body that will include indigenous groups and people in discussion around conservation and biodiversity, that is, to make them a part, a stakeholder in the entire process of conservation. Now, when it came to finances, that is where the developed countries had to pitch in. And under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, where there's a greater amount of responsibility on the developed countries, they were supposed to pitch in. But sadly, that did not happen. So that is why funding mechanism is still something which is dicey. And India has made its voice very clear that without the funding, when it comes to developing and underdeveloped countries, they would never be able to have so much protected areas. They would never be able to have conservation as the prime mechanism. We have seen what is happening in Africa. We have seen in the region of Botswana in Zimbabwe, where basically owing to the drought-like conditions, elephants are on the verge of being slaughtered to be supplied as food. So if you provide financial assistance, not only ecosystem can be restored, but these underdeveloped countries, they would conserve the biodiversity as well. They need to have a financial incentive to support the wildlife and the biodiversity. So there has, however, been an agreement to develop a new strategy for resource mobilization. What does that mean? That we don't have any strategy. We will develop a new strategy for resource mobilization, right? So that is one of the major sticking points. Now, what has been India's contribution when it comes to the Conference of Parties? Now, India has indicated that they had updated biodiversity plan where it expects to spend around 81,000 crore between the next five financial years from 2025 to 2030. Now, this will be a significant uptick from around 30,000 crores that were spent in the previous 5 years. Now, that is what India is saying, that look, we are using that expenditure and we are spending that much amount of money. Even we need financial assistance. We cannot do that. Other countries also need financial assistance, right? So, significant step in wildlife conservation has been taken by countries like India, where India has been a pioneer of International Big Cat Alliance, which talks about the conservation of all the various different species of big cats. India has increased the number of wetlands under conservation from 26 a few years back to almost around 85. The number is expected to hit 100 very soon. The number of protected areas across the country, they are also on the rise. There is a greater amount of focused attention given to certain species as well. So India is playing its part and India is contributing to it. But then the developed world also needs to follow that trait. Okay, so that is basically the outcome of Conference of Parties number 16. This can also sometimes be asked directly because after this, the next Conference of Parties will be held around after 2 years. So that is why this is something that you have to understand, can be asked in the mains examination. What is CBD? What were the outcomes of the Kali Conference of Parties? That can be a direct question also. But let us take a look at the prelims type question. Consider the following statement about recently held COP16 to the CBD. The COP meets annually to decide on the future course of actions to be taken. Cali Fund seeks to help the developing countries to increase the number of protected areas across the globe. Impact of invasive alien species to be reduced by 70% by around 2023. So here, select the answer from the codes. What do you think is the answer in this case? Let me know. Kanishak, Shankar, Shubham, Syed, Ranjan, Amir, Bora. Correct. So I will make you practice this correct, incorrect so many times that I hope that by the end of it, you are regularized to it. So let us take a look at it and analyze the statement. COP meets annually for the Conference of Parties? No. That is incorrect. It meets every 2 to 3 years. Cali Fund seeks to help the developing countries to increase the number of protected areas across the globe. Is that the purpose of the Cali Fund? No. Cali Fund has been set up to help the indigenous and the local population, right? That is the purpose, to ensure fair and equitable access and benefit sharing, not for increasing the regions under conservation. Impact of invasive alien species to be reduced by 50% by the year 2030. So this is also incorrect. So which of the statements above are incorrect? You have to understand all 3 of them are incorrect. I hope this is clear. Any doubts? Do feel free to ask. Now we move on to the next topic, and that is the Nature Conservation Index. India, how to increase wetland? See, wetlands won't be increased. The number of wetlands that are there, when we talk about, I'll come to it also. When we talk about wetlands, wetlands are what? These are some of the ecosystems which basically have the presence of aquatic conditions as well as the presence of terrestrial plants in that area, stagnant or standing water in that region. So when you talk about the Ramsar sites, that is going to increase. Being designated a status of Ramsar sites automatically means a increased protection level. So there are 9 different conditionalities. Any of those conditionalities, if they are fulfilled, that is basically sent to the Ramsar Convention, and the Secretariat then analyzes and picks that wetland to be chosen as a Ramsar site. So the number of Ramsar sites mean the wetlands are receiving increased amount of conservation. Okay? Bhanu, is due to global warming the Arctic and Antarctic landscapes turning into green? There is support for mosses and lichens. Is it good or bad? It is bad. Always bad. Because you see, when you have the natural ice being replaced by grasses, or for that matter in Antarctica last year was the first time that you had an annual flowering plant. Annual, that means present throughout the year, not seasonal. An annual flowering plant which grew across the coastal area of Antarctica, which means the coastal area remained ice-free throughout the year. Now, if that happens, automatically there is a reduced amount of solar rays which are reflected. The albedo value reduces, means the land will absorb more heat. When the land absorbs more heat, overall the surface will heat up. Also, when it is replaced by, ice is replaced by plants, particularly in the polar region, what happens? Now, when you have the presence of ice, that means the temperature is very low. So the rate of evaporation is what? Low. That means the water vapor supply in the atmosphere is what? Low. But then when that is replaced by plants or grasses, means what? there will be transpiration, loss of water vapor into the atmosphere, and when you have presence of water vapor, it is also a greenhouse gas, so it will lead to increased heating as well. Okay, I hope that is understood. Bhanu. Shankar, the 30 by 30 goal under COP15 is to be completed by the year 2030. Wetlands are major source of methane. How can we reduce the methane emission? Why does wetland become a source of methane emission? When the water evaporates. If you don't carry out encroachment in the wetland areas, let the wetland regions remain as they are. Right? For example, in many of our urban landscapes, the wetlands are encroached upon. If you don't do that, then basically you are ensuring that all that methane eventually is utilized by the organic species, and they die, decompose, and are returned to the ground. So just the conservation of wetlands will ensure that the methane emission does not happen. Then I have Raja Parthiban, how and where we can use these topic in our mains answer. Even other subjects also, right? Essay, geography. Geography optional, you have a direct previous year question about what is CBD, right? So it was a detailed question which was asked. And how can you use, you can have direct questions asked from that in the mains examination in GS paper 3 about, for example, the greenhouse effect is leading to increased level of warming. So there you can cite these reports. For example, some of the data pointers that the concentrate or carbon dioxide is responsible for around 81% of the warming between 1950 to around 2023. Those kind of data pointers you can always use, right? Otherwise also, when you talk about environmental geography in the case of the utility of in optional, you can use them as well. What is mainstreaming biodiversity? The conversation around biodiversity. That has to become a part of the mainstream. That is, government, stakeholders, they talk about the conservation measures. That is what is required. Okay? Atish, as of this month, we are going to have it on the YouTube platform. Okay? I hope that is solved. Now, the Nature Conservation, Global Nature Conservation Index, the first Global Nature Conservation Index report has been released. And India has been ranked 176 out of 118 nations. What are the reasons for that? We'll take a look at it. But here again, this index has been, this index basically indicates the amount of conservation of the nature in terms of the various parameters, the governance and the capacity build-up, the future trends, the land utilization, conservation of biodiversity, to what level is it happening? So based upon that parameters, the countries are listed on this. Okay, so here for your prelims examination, what is important? What are the which are the agencies which release the report? Always important. I hope you are maintaining a factoid sheet about the agencies who are releasing the report. Then secondly, on what parameters are they basically operating and giving that indexation? Thirdly, the overall position of the countries. It will never ask you which was the 100th country, but which is the leader, which is the laggard. And in the neighborhood of India, what is the condition? That is something you have to ensure for your prelims preparation. Now, here, what is it exactly? So, when we talk about the overall index, the Nature Conservation Index, developed by Goldman Sonnenfeld School of Sustainability and Climate Change at the Ben Gurion University of Negev and biodb.com, a non-profit website, both of them, they have come out with the Nature Conservation Index. None of these organizations are very big or very influential for that matter, but then nonetheless, they have come out with this. Now, here, Nature Conservation Index evaluates the conservation efforts made by the countries on 4 basic parameters: land management, threats to biodiversity, capacity and governance, and also the future trends of conservation. So based upon these 4 parameters, you have the indexation which is done for the countries. Now, India has scored an abysmal score. And in our vicinity also, other than Bhutan, No other country has done very good, but then India has performed particularly poorly in this case. So here, the key findings, India has a score of 45.5, giving it a proud rank of 176. But when you take a look at your own rank, when you get your result, the first curiosity is what? That how much has my neighbor got? So in this case, what is the score of China? China has basically scored around 48.34, is 164th. So it is not very good scenario for China also, but then India is at much worse situation. Bhutan is the only one in the entire subcontinent which has done particularly good. Now here, if you will observe the overall trend, which is indicated by as per the website of biodb.com. So they have published this graphics, the data, where they have indicated that the score of less than 50 is being observed in the region of Asia, South Asia in particular, and above 62.5 in which areas? Greenland, right? North Europe, Australia, etc. Now, what is the reason for poor score of India? We will come to that. Then, over exploitation of resources, pollution, deforestation. These are some of the reasons for low score of the countries in the Pacific Islands, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. But then these are some of the best performing nations out there. You have Luxembourg, Estonia, Denmark, Finland, the Northern European countries in particular, Luxembourg being the one of the exceptions, UK, Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe is also listed in the top 10, given the fact that Zimbabwe is ready to kill hundreds of elephants to fight off the famine conditions. But however, that is the rating and the ranking which has been generated. But if you take a look at the bottom 10, that is where among the larger countries, you'll find the presence of India, and among the larger economies, Turkey is also listed here. So Turkey is at the second last position out there. Now, reason for India's poor ranking. What is the reason? One of the prime reason is that we don't have accurate data with regards to land management, with regards to even our conservation outcomes. We don't have the accurate data. So basically, the compilers of the entire report and the index, they have come out with a statement, and they have used Peter Drucker's famous statement: something that you can't measure is something that you can never manage, right? So if you don't have the data pointer, means you cannot manage that biodiversity. That is the perspective that they have gone through. But other than that, also there are many areas of improvement that India has to look at. First of all, habitat loss and fragmentation is on the rise, owing to the expansion or the population pressure, increased urbanization, migration trends, patterns, etc. There has been significant amount of habitat loss and fragmentation of the habitat. This has led to wide-scale displacement of the biodiversity. And not only that, this has also increased the man-animal conflict. Whenever you have man-animal conflict, there is only one survivor, and that is man. Animal sadly perishes. Then biodiversity loss is very high in various parts of the country. There are conservation efforts which are underway under various programs, various schemes, but still we have a substantial amount of biodiversity loss. Then high use of pesticides has also been cited. That in our agricultural setup, the pesticide use is very high. Now, this pesticide use in the soil leads to soil pollution. Soil pollution will lead to pollution of the water bodies. But along with that, it will also lead to eventually bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Okay? What is this bioaccumulation and biomagnification? This is basically the buildup of contaminant within the body system, right? The contaminant or the pollutant, be it persistent organic pollutants, etc., they continue to build up. Insecticides, pesticides, many of the times they contain persistent organic pollutants as well. Which is the global convention which is in place to manage the persistent organic pollutants? Do let me know. Which do you think, what of them do you think is the global convention which has been in place to manage such kind of insecticides and pesticides? Do let me know. Now, lack of enough conservation of marine areas. In our country, the number of marine protected areas, they have not increased significantly. We have some of the very critical marine biodiversity which is there, like dugong, like you have the horseshoe crabs, right, which have remained and which have existed since the time of the dinosaurs, like the leatherback turtles, right? And also owing to the fact that due to lack of circulation of oceanic water, both Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, they do not have that much amount of biodiversity going ahead. So there is a need for conservation. In both the region of Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, you have the presence and the existence of dead zones as well. So that is one of the basic reasons why we have scored poorly. Marine protected areas are very, very less. Lack of enforcement to prevent smuggling. Smuggling of wildlife and wildlife associated goods. India ranks number 4 across the world. Stockholm Convention, very good. No, Minamata Convention is for mercury contamination, for mercury poisoning. Stockholm Convention is for persistent organic pollutants. So you see, when it comes to smuggling of wildlife and wildlife associated products, India ranks number 4. Globally, you have billions of dollars worth of wildlife products which are smuggled out of India. Be it animal parts, be it even, for example, red sanders. They are also smuggled. Exotic species are smuggled. They are both brought in and also taken out. So there is an inherent demand for such products even in our country. You still have many people within our country who prefer to buy goods made out of ivory. Whether for that animals and elephants have been killed, they don't care. So that is where we have to have a much stronger enforcement mechanism, and Wildlife Crime Control Bureau is an agency which needs to be very, very active. Then inefficient land management. Without proper data, land records in our country are some of the worst kept records out there when you talk about the state level and the local level. So that is where digitization of the records, ensuring that there is proper amount of encroachment doesn't happen randomly, and the land is utilized for natural purposes, natural landscape development, etc., rather than for damaging purposes. So these are some of the reasons why India has scored absolutely poorly in this. Okay. Now, let us take a look at the practice question. Which of the following are the parameters used to calculate Nature Conservation Index? Take a look at that and let me know which is the correct answer. Shreya, sir, can we not say that Bhu-Aadhaar is helpful in... It is helpful, yes, Shreya, correct. But that needs to be significantly supported and implemented across the country. Many of the states are still very laggards in terms of digitization of the land record. Okay. Shubham, Mumtaz, Pamay, Vasu, Muskan, correct. Munna, correct. Arun, correct. Kipgen, correct. So here, which is the incorrect parameter which is mentioned here? Megha, if you write D 50 times also, that doesn't make it correct, right? So here, what are the 4 parameters on which the Nature Conservation Index is measured? First is the land management. Second is the threat and the conservation of biodiversity. Third is capacity and governance. And fourth is basically future trends. What is going to be the future expected course of action? This is not a measure or a parameter. This comes within the categorization of land management itself. So 1 is incorrect. So that means C will be the correct answer. Okay. So here all of the rest are correct. Okay. I hope none of you have any doubt associated. Now we move on to another portion relevant for your prelims, that is Emission Gap Report 2024. So this Emission Gap Report, again, just like WMO's report, this is also released for the purpose of UNFCCC, right? United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Parties number 29 for that Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is going to meet in Baku, Azerbaijan. So for that, you basically have the Emission Gap Report, which has been submitted and which has been generated. Now, who generates Emission Gap Report? You have UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, which generates the annual Emission Gap Report. What is this Emission Gap Report? It talks about or measures the overall amount of emission and what is required to be fulfilling the agenda of keeping the level of temperature at a lower degree, right? To limit the level of warming. So what is the agenda here? That is something which needs to be understood. So here, UNEP, by the way, is an organization which was created when? When is it that UNEP was created? UNEP was created in 1972 on the sidelines of the Stockholm Conference. It is not a convention. Stockholm Conference. It is different from Stockholm Convention. So, Stockholm Conference, right, on man and environment. That is when UNEP was set up. So, this has been released ahead of the UNFCCC Conference of Parties number 29. What are some of the key findings? We'll directly jump into that. So, first of all, the global greenhouse gas emissions, they have set a new record in 2023, a 1.3% increase from 2022 levels. Here, what is it that you have to look into? So with the help of the data and the chart that UNEP has released, let us talk about that itself. This is about the greenhouse gas emission. So sectoral greenhouse gas emission, sector-wise greenhouse gas emission, that data is important. So first of all, here, the largest amount of emission is from energy sector. So here, out of that, power occupies the largest share, right? 26% of the overall emission for greenhouse gases is for generation of power. Now, with global warming taking place, greenhouse gases, the proportion of it increasing, there will be increased amount of global warming. There will be rise in temperature. So whenever that happens, requirement of power will increase, demand for energy will increase, means there can be further more emissions unless and until we shift to renewables. Then industry is responsible for 11%. So, power maximum, after that to be followed by transportation. Within transportation, road sector 11%, aviation also account for substantial 2%, right? 6% by buildings, fuel production. In the exploration, extraction, marketing and selling of the fuel, in the entire process, the fuel production, there is greenhouse gas emission. Industrial processes which are carried out, then agriculture, all of that are then thereby. So you don't need to learn all the data pointers. Energy sector, most dominant source. Within energy sector, power generation and transportation, most dominant source. So if you can think about it, power generation and transportation alone are responsible for more than 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions across the world. Sriram, this report was so inclined towards Europe. Why should we take it so seriously in policy making? That too, Zimbabwe doing best. How can we rely on this report on policy matters? See, it is true that not every report here is very neutral for that matter, or is not very transparent. Many of the times, the people who bring these reports, they don't have enough background study also, which they do. They basically search the internet, look at the some of the data that they can scar out of internet. They don't carry out field surveys, right? And they provide you with a poor ranking, etc. But then it is also a reality that we have a lot of steps to cover in order to prevent the loss of biodiversity, in order to conserve nature. Smuggling of animal products, is that a reality? And plant products, is that a reality in India? Yes. Fragmentation of habitat, is that a reality in India? Yes. Then the aspect of deforestation, is that a reality in India? Yes. Northeastern states have experienced some of the massive level of deforestation owing to the unholy nexus, and we have talked about it previously as well. You have the unholy nexus between the corporations, between the politicians and the bureaucrats in many of the cases, which have led to large-scale deforestation. So, yes, there are areas which require a lot of improvement. But then, is that report going to be our only parameter on the basis of which we are going to judge ourselves? No. India has not followed that policy. India has followed the policy historically and traditionally for thousands of years to lead by example. We have respected nature historically. We worship nature, right? So that is where we need to get our own house in order. And yes, the policy reports, the rankings can show us a direction. That doesn't become a final crucible or the etching in stone, but areas of improvement we have to always take into account, right? Now, after that, another finding has been that greenhouse gas emissions across G20 members has also increased in 2023 and accounted for 77% of the global emission. 77% of the global emissions are by G20 countries alone. And this time, UNEP has come out with a very interesting chart. Right, this is present in the report itself. So let me talk about that chart as well. Let us spend some time here. So here, first of all, what are the parameters of the chart? Total greenhouse gas emission in 2023 in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Then change in the total greenhouse gas emission as compared to last year, 2022 to 2023. Is there an increase in emission or reduction in emission? Then another column talks about the per capita greenhouse gas, that is total emission divided by population, right? Per capita, what is the emission? And the most interesting is historical emissions since 1850 to 2022. So here, basically, take a look at that. Look at the emissions by China. Emissions by China alone, they account for 30% of the total in the last year, right? That tells you that the developmental paradigm across the world is changing. From the regions of Europe and North America emitting more, now it is China. US accounts for 11%. India accounts for 8%. India is the third major emitter. Despite the fact that US never leaves an opportunity to preach us about how to deal with climate, how to deal with nature, US emits more than us. Then you have the European Union, Russian Federation, etc. Now, another important part is the change as compared to 2022. US has indicated a decline in terms of greenhouse gas emission. European Union has indicated a massive decline in greenhouse gas emission. Both India and China have indicated an increase, with India indicating the maximum percentage increase as compared to 2022. Then per capita emission, we are at a very low rating, at a very low level, because our population is high, right? When we take a look at the historical emissions, so here historical gigatons of CO2, so here percentage of total, China historically is now responsible for 12% of the total emission in that 150-year period. Then US alone is accountable for 20%. India only 3%. That is why when India advocates for the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, India does that realizing that our emission level, what they are today, they have increased quite recently, right? And they have increased because of the fact that we don't have any alternative to achieve our economic progress. But the developed countries, which should show the way, they are actually running away from responsibility. EU, again 12%. Historically, Russian Federation 7%, Brazil, African Union, etc. So overall, you see that historical emission is less. China also had historically very less amount of emission when this data pointer was calculated up till the 1990s, which tells you that in the past 20 to 30 years, which is merging and coinciding with the rapid exponential growth of China. That is the time where China has emitted a lot of greenhouse gas and also a lot of carbon dioxide emission. This is also one of the reasons that now China has reached that economic progress pinnacle, and now China is ready to give funds for various different purposes, for nature conservation, for Cali Fund also. China is one of the first contributors, where China has contributed millions of dollars for that Cali Fund as well. So across the global sphere, China is now turning into this and following the same path taken by the Americans and the Europeans, that I have polluted, I have attained the economic progress that I needed to. Now I will be the preacher, I will generate money out of it. This is where India has got a lot of catching up to do. Now, then progress in ambition and action. Since the initial nationally determined contribution were a part of what? Under which particular agreement were the countries supposed to give the nationally determined contribution? Under the provisions of the Paris Agreement. So that is when the initial nationally determined contributions, right? So what were the initial contribution that the countries had decided? Most of the countries have changed that. Owing to the fact that they were unable to achieve, most of the countries have changed that. India is amongst the large countries and large economies which is still on its way to achieve the amount of emission target reduction that it had set for itself, right? So here, if you take a look at it, the change in emission under unconditional NDC relative to 2019 levels. So here you will have India, then Turkey, Mexico. Now here the orange and the purple color, they indicate post-peak countries and pre-peak countries. This is also a very interesting chart. Post-peak means what? The countries which have attained the peak of emissions, means they have already attained that kind of economic progress, the economic peak. Their overall emission level won't increase anymore. It can lie stagnant or will plateau or will reduce thereby, right? Whereas when you talk about pre-peak countries like India, China, Indonesia, in Turkey, in all these, the amount of emission is expected to increase going ahead in the coming decades. So that is why it is aimed that the countries need to achieve that peak as early as possible so that further cooling can be initiated. Okay. Now, achieving net zero. The other key findings: achieving net zero by 2050 requires 900 billion to 2.1 trillion, right? Almost 1% of the global GDP needs to be deployed almost annually. Are we close to achieving that? Absolutely not. The countries, the developed countries which had promised, as per UNFCCC recommendations, they have not paid that. By which instrument thus emissions are calculated from industrial era? It is basically, Deepika, what is done, you see, you have various different kind of tools, various different kinds of ways in which you can determine what would be the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere 300 years back, 400 years back, 1000 years back, or 1 million years back. How do you do that? So there are multiple ways in which you do. First of all, what you do? One is dendrochronology, where when you talk about the, for example, redwood trees, few of the trees, they last for hundreds of years, right? So studying the rings of the trees gives you an idea about the global climate at that point of time. Even the fossils of the trees will give you an idea. So they also give you a historic information. Second, by study of ice cores, that is the cores, the amount of, so you dig up the ice up till a great depth, depending upon your calculation that how much ice would have been deposited in the past 300 or 400 years. And that ice that you extract will give you an idea about the atmospheric conditions which were prevalent at that point of time. Then many of the times, even the oceanic study, oceanic drilling in terms of the sedimentation in the oceans, the kind of species that you find, that also gives you an idea what would have been the atmospheric composition at that point of time. So you have multiple mechanisms by which you can gain an estimate of what would have been the CO2 concentration in the 1700s, in the 1600s, and then today you can measure it with the help of satellites, so you can carry out a comparative study. Okay. Sanj, why Indian institution not prepare and in public any environmental report for the globe? That is basically because we don't have those global institutions which are present, to be very frank. We don't have such global institutions which who have the bandwidth to carry out the research across the globe, right? So this will happen. This generally happens when the countries, they move up the developmental ladder. That is when the countries are able to do so. Okay. Now, a reduction of at least 7.5% of emission each year by 2035 is essential to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise as compared to pre-industrial era, that target under reach. Scaling the solar and wind energy in itself can deliver 27% of required emission reduction. That is power being shifted to renewables. Forest conservation and restoration in itself accounts for 20% of the reduction, because you see, deforestation is another major source of carbon dioxide emission. When you cut down a forest, not only does the ability of the land to absorb CO2 reduce, but the cutting down of tree also leads to emission of CO2. So the forested area, rather than becoming a sink, becomes a source of emission. So that is where this forest conservation, which will also serve the nature conservation, it will also help in global environmental control, right? Let us take a look at the practice question. Any doubts, anyone, do feel free to ask. Consider the following statements about in the context of the recently released emission gap report. It is an annual report released by UNFCCC. Historically, US has the highest burden of emissions over the past 150 years. Energy sector accounts for the largest source of emission, which is the correct answer. Deepika, I hope your question is, the doubt that you had is clear. And Sanj, I hope that your doubt is also clear. So what is the correct answer in this case? Shreya, if you could ask in the historical CO2 column of the report, are they referring to the period, if your entire question is not visible, Shreya, if you can, are they referring to the period of the Industrial Revolution? Yes, Yes, historically, traditionally. So here, most of you are correct this time. It is an annual report released by UNFCCC. Is that correct? No, incorrect. Historically, US has the highest burden of emissions over the past 150 years. That is correct, isn't it? We have taken a look at it, almost accounting for close to around 20%. This is correct. Energy sector accounts for the largest source of emission. That is also correct. Within energy sector, which is the sector which is accounting for the most maximum amount of emission within the energy sector? Do let me know. So 2 and 3 are correct. So the correct answer in this case is going to be B. That is only 2. Okay. Now, then we come to the species and the places in news. Right? This is an addendum to the bi-weekly places in news that we carry out. So here, this is for the environmental portion. So I would suggest that while you are following, till now we have had 4 episodes of places in news. While I'm sure you are maintaining a catalog for your prelims preparation and attempting the questions that we are putting up, along with that, for these areas, protected areas that are in news, species which are in news, you maintain an A4 sheet. That will significantly reduce the burden of preparation before the exam. That is a guarantee. Right? Before the prelims, you won't have to scamper through notes, run from pillar to post that tell me which are the species important this year. This will be significantly easing your burden. So tiger translocation and relocation, need for genetic diversity. So this is basically the news where a tiger is being shifted from Tadoba Reserve in Maharashtra, Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve, to Simlipal. Now, Simlipal Tiger Reserve is situated in Odisha, and it is one of those areas where you also have an elephant reserve, also you have a tiger reserve. Now, in the region of Simlipal, what is the issue? In the region of Simlipal, you have the very now prominent and famous, the black tiger population. Right? Very good. Power sector. Very good. So in Simlipal, you basically have, Nasimuddin, after this topic, you can ask the question. In Simlipal, you have the pseudo-melanistic tigers. Pseudo-melanistic tigers. What do we mean by melanistic tiger or melanistic species? So melanin is a kind of pigment which is produced. Now, any change in the genetic makeup, that is any defect in the genetic makeup, that oftentimes leads to a kind of interruption either in excessive or in deficiency production of melanin. And as a consequence of that, the coloration pattern of the body changes. So Simlipal, because you have lesser number of tigers which are geographically isolated, it is the report which has been generated by the forest experts. They have indicated that there is a kind of an inbreeding amongst the tiger population. So there's a lack of genetic diversity. The genetic traits which are required, that is not there. So that is why tigers from other areas are being introduced there, so that there can be a kind of a healthy offspring which can be generated, and genetic diversity needs to be maintained. You see, genetic diversity for any species is very important for the process of conservation. Unless and until you ensure that there is a genetic diversity, the species, they won't develop the fit traits or the natural traits progressing from one generation to another. And the lack of genetic diversity also means that the species are prone to threats and extinction, maybe by diseases, maybe by some impact in terms of change of abiotic factors like temperature, water availability, right? Different genetic makeups have different kinds of abilities to tackle the changes. So, and by the way, what do we mean by genetic diversity? Like, for example, in the case of tiger, you have the Amur tiger, right? You have the or the Siberian tiger, you have the Royal Bengal tiger, you have the presence of the Sumatran tiger, the very rare, the extinct, already extinct Tasman tiger. So you have various different types of genetic species of tiger population: lions, Asiatic lion, African lion, Asiatic elephants, African elephants, Sumatran elephants. So these are different genetic varieties. As many different genetic varieties exist means there is not only a better chance for the survival of the species, but also the changes and the adaptations that the species needs to undertake in order to have a maintained survival and increased rate of reproduction with the changing conditions nearby. So that is what is required. That is the need of genetic diversity. So what is the context? Odisha government has translocated a tigress named Yojana from Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra to the Simlipal Tiger Reserve. For this, by the way, anywhere where you are translocating a species of tiger, a prior permission needs to be taken from National Tiger Conservation Authority. NTCA needs to be intimated about that, and you need to have permission from NTCA. Now, why? So, translocation was aimed at enhancing genetic diversity in Simlipal, where there are concerns about inbreeding. Inbreeding means from the same family tree, you have the mating and the offsprings within the same family tree. So that means there will always be genetic defects, right? So this is your normal tiger, Royal Bengal tiger that you have seen. But then in Simlipal, you have the pseudo-melanistic tigers. This is what the pseudo-melanistic tigers appear to look like. Now, this is where Simlipal is also thinking about, and it has taken the prior approval of NTCA also in order to have a different kind of tiger safari altogether for the people to be able to view these kind of, because this is very rare. It is not everywhere that you will find these melanistic tigers to be in existence, right? So NTCA gives approval for the translocation projects to be carried out. Now, Odisha Tiger estimation conducted in 2024 found a total of 24 adult tigers in Simlipal with presence of pseudo-melanistic tigers. Now, what is that pseudo-melanistic? So, it is melanism, when we talk about melanism in itself, a kind of a genetic condition in which increased production of melanin, a substance which provides in the skin that produces hair, eye and skin pigmentation, results in black skin, feathers or hair in an animal. The pigmentation in itself gets impacted. As a consequence, many Royal Bengal tigers of Simlipal belong to a unique lineage with higher than normal levels of melanin, which gives them, now understand, let's suppose one species or one individual had higher than expected level of melanin, right, in one family. Now, if the breeding would have happened from a normal or a different tiger with a normal amount of melanin, then you would have had a healthy offspring. But within the same family, if you have inbreeding, then what happens? Those character traits become more dominant, right? Then these tigers are not entirely black and are therefore described as pseudo-melanistic, right? Now, in the region of Simlipal, plans are also in place to set up a melanistic tiger safari, and NTCA's approval has already been taken about it. So, the Simlipal Tiger Reserve is the only habitat across the world where you find these kind of tigers. And this is because lack of enough genetic diversity. So, what you need to be aware of? What are pseudo-melanistic tigers? Why do they exist in India where they are found? Simlipal in Odisha. So, what is the way out of it? Translocate the tigers. From some other areas, move the tigers to that region. From that region, move the tiger outwards, right? So that is where proper mixing, if it will happen, then automatically the situation can be taken care of, right? Now, here a mains question has been asked previously in the GS paper 3. It has also been asked in geography optional. So you can expect that kind of a question. What is meant by genetic diversity? discuss its importance in conservation of biodiversity. So, how do you attempt this question? So, when you write the intro, the introduction to the answer, what do you address here? You address what do you understand by genetic diversity. What is meant by genetic diversity? So, genetic diversity refers to the presence of various different genetic makeup of the same species which exhibit different kind of characteristic traits spread across different geographical regions. That indicates genetic diversity of a species. That will be your intro. Now, for example, that also you can provide. For example, Asiatic elephants, then African elephants, Sumatran rhino, then Indian rhino, then tiger, Amur tiger, or then you have Caspian tiger, then you have the the extinct Tasman tigers, the Sumatran tiger, Royal Bengal tiger. You can give the examples of that. Now, then you talk about in the body portion about it, that the importance of genetic diversity. Here, you can give the example of the vulnerabilities that species of the same genetic makeup they face. For example, you had the lion population. This is a very famous example. Lion population in Africa was on the verge of being wiped out because in the region of Serengeti in the Tanzania, and that is in the eastern portion of Africa, in 1994, you had the outbreak of CDV, that is the canine distemper virus. This outbreak of CDV alone in 1994 claimed the lives of 1,000 African lions. So imagine that a particular disease can itself eradicate a lot of population. Having a genetic diversity ensures resilience, ensures a different reaction and the sustenance and survivability of the species as well. So those things you have to and you can always highlight here. Right? Then you also talk about the requirement of geographical distance to be maintained in case that genetic diversity is not there, and that is where the tiger translocation we are doing in Simlipal, that is where the lion relocation program under Project Lion, where the lions are being transported and transferred out of the Gir region, all that you can mention. Okay? I hope this is clear. Now, then Kodo millet is another one of those species which is in use. So, why is Kodo millet in use? This is also owing to the Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve, which is present in eastern portion of Madhya Pradesh. Now, in Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve, for the first time, and in, for example, anywhere across India, this is something which is reported for the first time in near memory, that is 10 elephants have died, right? In a very short span of time, 10 elephants have died. And earlier it was suspected that those elephants could have died owing to poisoning by hunters, by poachers, or sometimes it is suspected that even the villagers might have done that in order to protect their crops. But the investigation has indicated that all these elephants, they had their belly full of the Kodo millet. So that Kodo millet is being cited as one of the causative factors causing the death of the elephants. Now it is a millet. So that Kodo millet, what is its purpose? So this is a kind of a millet which is very hardy, right? One of the very sturdy crop varieties. Any condition of soil moisture, it will grow. Any condition of rainfall, it will grow. Any condition overall, it can thrive. And it is very nutritious as well. It can control the sugar levels, the blood pressure levels. It can treat asthma, and it is very beneficial to us also. So it is generally, Kodo millet is consumed by the local indigenous population, by the tribal population in the region. But there is a problem. With this Kodo millet, there is always an associated fungal growth which also happens. And that fungal growth becomes a poison, right? So when after that it is consumed, then that can immediately impact the nerves. Nerves in the sense it can impact the messaging, because our nervous system, it with the help of the dendrons, it carries out the messaging. Now, how does it carry out the messaging? For that, you have the requirement of another nutrient, that is calcium. So, this fungal species, when it is ingested, it produces certain amount of chemicals, and that impacts the calcium concentration in the body, and that impacts the messaging from the nerve centers. That leads to eventual nervous damage. It can lead to pulmonary diseases. It can even lead to death. And that is something which is being suspected as the prime cause for the death of elephants in Bandhavgarh. Right? So here, what is the Kodo millet? This is what the Kodo millet looks like. Chances are you would also have seen that in your vicinity somewhere or the other. So Kodo millet is also known as the grass or the rice grass, and it is a type of a cereal grain cultivated and consumed widely across central India, even in Deccan Plateau. So consumed by the local populace. Also grown in Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, West Africa, Pakistan and Thailand. So it is not only restricted to India, but it is very beneficial for health purposes. So high in fiber, right, and will help in manage conditions including asthma, migraines, high blood pressure, etc. All of that can be managed with this, right? Now, this happened in the region of Bandhavgarh. So, natural consumption of Kodo millet, can that be a destructive factor? No. But this Kodo millet is prone to fungal growth, and consumption of that fungi, that can be damaging. So how do you control that? How can we control that? So there can be a microbiological solution also in place, where you introduce some of the microbes which can limit the growth of the fungi, so that the plant remains or the crop remains fit for consumption. Okay. Now, Bandhavgarh, this is the area in news, place in news. So it is important. So it is situated in the Umaria district of Madhya Pradesh, between the Vindhyas and the Satpura. It has got the presence, and it is mythologically relevant as well, having found its mention in the folklores, in the mythological tales of Ramayana as well as Mahabharata. So it is important in that respect as well. Here you will have significant amount of tiger population, very significant concentration of tiger population. Having said that, Bandhavgarh has been in news infamously even last year, owing to the death of tiger. Even this year, there has been a death of tiger in Bandhavgarh. So this is a region which has remained infamous, right? Now, the type of vegetation, mostly dry deciduous with the presence of some amount of moist vegetation also, tendu trees, etc., which come under the category of dry deciduous. And you also have a lot of bamboo vegetation, which is an ideal camouflage for tigers in the region. Okay, but along with that, this is a vital elephant corridor, where you have the elephants moving from the region of Chhattisgarh all the way into Madhya Pradesh also, right? So Bandhavgarh, located between the Vindhyan and Satpura ranges in the Umaria district, declared a national park in 68, designated as a tiger reserve in 1993. It is characterized by valleys, hills and the very famous Bandhavgarh Fort. Consists of tropical moist deciduous forest with sal, tendu, mixed forest, grasslands and bamboo stretches to be present. Okay. Now, consider the following statements about Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve recently in news. First, it is the largest tiger reserve in the country. It consists of natural population of Asiatic lions outside of the Gir forest. It is rich in shola vegetation, beneficial for herbivore population. How many of the above statements are incorrect? So here, largest tiger reserve in the country? No, that is incorrect. It is not the largest tiger reserve in the country. Consists of natural population of Asiatic lions outside the Gir forest? No. So which is the largest tiger reserve in the country? Nagarjun Sagar Sri Salem Tiger Reserve is one of the largest tiger reserves in the country. Consists of natural population of Asiatic lions? No. At one point of time in history, the central portion of India would have those. But presently, the entire Asiatic lion population is restricted to the Gir forest. It is rich in shola vegetation, beneficial for herbivore population? No. Shola vegetation is restricted in the region of Nilgiris in particular. So how many of the above statements is or are incorrect? All the three statements are incorrect. So the answer in this is C. I hope you are able to get that. Okay. Now, you have a butterfly which is in news, which has been found in our country for a long period of time. But then the unique relationship between the butterfly and an orchid species is something which has been found for the first time, garnering a lot of interest. This was initially found in the region of Kannur in southern part of India, also to be found in the region of Sri Lanka. That is the Nilgiri tit butterfly. So here, Nilgiris have recorded the first time in India the tit butterfly utilizing a large terrestrial orchid plant as a host. So that in itself is a unique event. And that butterfly belongs to the Lacindae family, and it was first described in 1884 from Kannur, but presently you will also be able to find that butterfly species in the region of Sri Lanka. This is found in the region of Nilgiris, that is in the area of western Tamil Nadu, in the region of eastern Kerala, southern Karnataka. That is where you'll find the species. So in the Kalakar Tiger Reserve, Chinar Wildlife Sanctuary in Idukki district and Silent Valley National Park of the Palakkad area, in all these areas you find this butterfly. Okay, so what is that butterfly? Which is that butterfly? That is something you have to be aware of. Now coming to the last topic of the day, and that is the Great Indian Bustard. Now it has been found out. Now, Great Indian Bustard is a critically endangered species. At one point of time, their population was widespread from the region of central India all the way to the region of eastern India. So it was widespread, even in the surrounding region of Pakistan. But now that Great Indian Bustard species is under increased amount of threat, right? So the attention and the immediate amount of focus is for the conservation of the bustard species. How to carry out the conservation and the preservation of the bustard species. So here, this bustard species, because when the population dwindles, that poses a lot of impact, lot of threat. Why? Because when the species, they detect a kind of a harsh condition, a harsh environment, then generally the reproduction process does not happen, right? So the numbers keep on declining. However, with the devising of mechanisms like artificial insemination, that is something which can always have a healthy population which is maintained. As of now, the population of Great Indian Bustard is primarily restricted to the region of Rajasthan and some of the surrounding areas of Gujarat, Maharashtra, etc. Also, you find the Great Indian Bustard. So, a Great Indian Bustard, which is also the state bird of Rajasthan, successfully hatched an offspring through artificial insemination in the Jaisalmer district, and that is a significant milestone. So here, the conditions of conservation are required, IUCN. They are critically endangered as per CITES, that is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. They are put under Appendix 1. Then CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, also known as Bonn Convention. So Appendix 1 of CITES means maximum conservation is required. And this is your Bonn Convention. Okay. So under the Bonn Convention also included in Appendix 1, which means conservation level or the requirement is maximum. As per the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, also included in Schedule 1. right? Now, official estimates indicate that fewer than 150 Great Indian bustards are left in the wild, with 90% residing in the desert regions of Rajasthan and remainder to be found in Gujarat, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. So that is the case of the Great Indian bustard. Now, when we talk about these Great Indian bustard, you have to understand that these have a requirement of open lands, right? They don't particularly grow well or thrive where you have very dense vegetation. They require a semi-arid landscape to exist, and that is the primary requirement. Now, you have other species of bustards as well. So that is present across. Historically, these were also the species which were present across, just like the lions that we talked about. These were also the species which were present all across the portion of central India, extending into the Deccan Plateau, the Peninsula Plateau as well. And that is where they would extend all the way up till the region of Karnataka. But then, owing to the fragmentation and the loss of habitat, many of the times what also happens, for example, if you take a look at a kind of the case study in Rajasthan only, you have these semi-arid landscapes. Now, many of the times these semi-arid landscapes are treated as wastelands, right? So when you treat that semi-arid landscape as a wasteland, what happens? This semi-arid landscape, by the way, is the natural habitat. The bustards don't prefer dense grassland or dense vegetation, but you have classified it as a wasteland. That means when you have to allocate land for, let's suppose, infrastructure building, you will dedicate this wasteland, isn't it? Divert this wasteland. When you basically have to, let's suppose, transfer land for any reclamation purposes, for the construction of urban area, you will dedicate this wasteland, isn't it? So that is why when we talk about these wastelands, classification of many of these semi-arid landscape as wasteland is one of the key issues why it leads to the destruction of the habitat. The same problem is also faced by another species in India, and that is the species of Karasal. Karasal is also one of those species. It is a feline species belonging to the family of cats. So Karasal also faces the same kind of an issue. Okay, so that is where you basically have to understand that in those areas also, those wasteland semi-arid areas, they are being diverted for agriculture, for cultivation. People want to have some economic output out of that, and that is where they use that. And that is where they lose their natural habitat, they lose their hunting space, and leads to the decline in population. So when we talk about the bustards, the threats that they face, and this is a matter which has reached the doorsteps of the Supreme Court as well. Many of these bustards, they have an impact owing to the power lines. For example, when a region is classified as a wasteland, you will have power lines, power network going there, isn't it? And when you have these power lines, that is when these bustards get entangled in those power lines, and that leads to the death as well. So that is also one of the impact associated. So these are where the bustard population suffers. So you have them in the, for example, in the Desert National Park in Jaisalmer, that is also one of the areas where the bustard population is under increased amount of threat, right? So overall, if you take a look at the threats posed, what are the various threats posed? Increased urbanization, right? Increased urbanization, encroachment, wasteland, etc. Okay, population pressure. That brings us to the end of the discussion. Any questions that you have which are still unanswered, please feel free to ask. Let me see if we have any of the questions. I hope the session has been helpful. So do revise these topics. Do carry out is there any In the neighboring area of Pakistan also, sometimes the bustard is found. Okay? Till we meet again, I hope this session has been meaningful, productive. Please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, do revise, relax, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.